Greetings once again from Richmond. I hope that everybody's safe and healthy and that life is sort of going along swimmingly as we find ourselves in this seclusion. The coronavirus shutdown, of course, continues in Richmond, and as I mentioned in the last lecture, it's going to go on for some time here. We've received some news where apparently the governor believes that Richmond's not going to hit its zenith on this thing, then perhaps until perhaps sometime early in June, which is the reason why he set the date for June 10th for the city to be in a stay-at-home sort of situation. So we remain here. Yesterday, I actually fired up my Volkswagen for the first time in about a month. In fact, the last time I had actually driven the car was the day that our class met just before our very long, now seemingly endless spring break. And so I got it to turn over on about the third try. It's not good to let an old car sit for a month like that. And I took it out for a little spin, and I ended up actually at a place that you guys are probably familiar with. I went to the Willow Lawn Shopping Center. And I have to say, since my wife and I have not been out much, it was an eerie experience. The only things that were open in the mall on a Sunday afternoon, when usually it's absolutely bustling there, was the grocery store. The Kroger was open. And of course, apparently in Virginia, as in many states, we consider the liquor stores an essential sort of thing. So the ABC store was opened, and then the Starbucks drive-through. And otherwise, nobody in the parking lots, nobody around, and there's very little traffic, obviously, out on the roads because of the stay-at-home business. Um, and he began to realize, actually, how much of this stuff you take for granted, just your ability to go out and hang out somewhere. I haven't really mentioned to you guys my grading habits, but I tend never to grade either at the office or at home. What I usually do is I pack the stuff up and I sit in a coffee shop somewhere with the white noise in the background, which for me removes distraction. And I set myself quotas. I'll grade 5 papers sitting at one place, and then I will pick up stakes, go somewhere else, have some more caffeine, and grade 5 more. And so I've had to alter my habits, and maybe why actually it's taking a little bit longer to get rid of the exams than usual. But those are proceeding, and I'll be getting those back to you sooner rather than later. Uh, Once again, I'm recording this the day before it's actually supposed to be posted. Bad on me. I had intended not to do this again, but I don't think there are going to be any problems. I'm doing this fairly early in the morning, so it'll have plenty of time to be posted and appear tomorrow morning for you. The reason why this is the case, I'd intended to do this on Sunday rather than Monday, but I had a bit of an interruption. Basically, the Sunday preceding yesterday, I had written a brief opinion piece to submit to the Richmond Times-Dispatch, something dealing with the comparison people have been making between the Black Death of the 14th century, a topic later in our syllabus here, in fact, and the coronavirus that we're being affected by now. And so I sent it in and didn't know whether I would hear back from them or not. But then this past Wednesday, I received an email in which they informed me, the editors, that it would be appearing actually in this Sunday's commentary section. And in fact, it appeared yesterday. And what this meant is I got kind of a barrage of emails from people, and I consequently had to spend a fair amount of time answering people. As you can probably gather, I'm not the best in the world with email, and when I get a flood of them like that, it just kind of aggravates me. But anyway, I took care of that, and by that point, I felt like I was not in the best shape mentally to go ahead and do the lecture, so I'm taking care of these things this morning. Uh, it is a rarity when you're doing something that's pre-modern to have your field to be considered relevant in a way. And so I felt that it was almost a public responsibility to say a little bit of something about this, particularly since a lot of the stuff that you're seeing about the Black Death can be a little frantic and not necessarily completely factual. And so what I did is I wrote this thing, and as you should already know, when you're writing for a public outlet like a newspaper, it's a very different type of writing than academic writing. Basically, you need to keep it brief, and you're operating with a very strict word limit. I think actually for the Times Dispatch, it's about 750 words for an editorial. You need to make certain your information is accurate, um, but you don't want to compact things so much that by nature inherently becomes mildly misleading. So you're dealing with that tension as you write it. And you want to make a point that's useful for the public in this moment. It's not just for past reference. And so you have all these things going on in it, and it is a different type of writing. You also can't have a pedantic tone. You don't want to sound like you have an academic stick shoved up your backside. And so it's like I said, it's a very different sort of thing. And I should note about this is that your class, this medieval England class, is mentioned sort of obliquely, indirectly at the very end of it when the Times Dispatch identifies who I am. And since that's the case, since you are actually sort of a factor in this, what I'll do is I'll send an email out with the online version of the article attached. And since also this is the topic we'll be talking about in fairly excruciating, but I think somewhat interesting detail a bit later in the semester. I'm alleged to actually know something about it, believe it or not. And so we'll get that up for you so you can take a look at it. As far as today's topic, which is English universities, I do encourage you once again to go to Blackboard. I've already posted an outline and some study questions for this. On this one, there's no reading assignment. I decided since when I was redoing the syllabus, and since I couldn't assume you would have access to the materials in AMPT, that I would just drop the reading assignment. I didn't think it was really that necessary in a way. And so this is the one topic where you're not burdened with anything else. You can just actually listen to this. What else to say about these things? Well, one thing, just as a general observation, when I go to the YouTube side, I notice that particularly for the last topic, there hadn't been a lot of hits on it. And I don't want to get into a big brotherish sort of thing, because the reason why I'm doing the course this way is to allow you to basically look at these things when you have the chance and when you have the access to the internet to do it. And so I don't expect people to immediately troop in and see these things. But the one thing I would caution you about, as with reading anything, you don't want to get too far behind. You want to keep up with it a little bit, take a few notes, and then if you need to refer back to the film later, you can, which is one of the big advantages of this, that the lecture just isn't done once ephemerally in class and vanishes on you. You can actually go back to it, but you don't want to have too much of that stack up on you before you deal with your final exam at the end of the semester. So that's just sort of a caution, but you people are all adults, and so you can figure this one out for yourself, and obviously you all have your own constraints on your time and on your access to the internet. But you know, it'd make me feel more comfortable if I had a sense that people were staying more or less up with the material. About this particular lecture, doing the last one in a single sitting kind of wore me down, and I'm sure it has worn you down, and it may be part of the reason why most of you haven't gotten through it or to it yet. And so what I've decided to do for this topic is to break it up into halves. There will be a part 1 and a part 2 posted for this. And one thing I should note, I'd mentioned the possibility of cosplay, of my actually having a wardrobe change. Well, I will be doing that for the second half of this where it becomes relevant. And so without any further ado, we're going to move into the notion of universities. And I'm not, some of you have already taken other medieval courses, and I don't know to what degree this topic was addressed in them. My wife does most of the medieval teaching, obviously, here, and I'm not certain in every instance what she has on her syllabus. But for me, particularly since for many of you this will be the only medieval course you'll take, I think that this is a great topic for you to know a bit more about, since you are in a university. And as you've probably already figured out for yourselves, because of the shutdown and because of the economic problems we're experiencing as a consequence of it, and because of the effect it's having on teaching, I mean, I never in my life thought I would be putting lectures online for people to see. There are a lot of questions banging around about what the coronavirus is going to do to university education, and also, well, to education generally. And what will the universities look like? Will they be fundamentally altered by this experience that we're having? And I think in this context, it's a fairly significant thing for you to know a bit more about them, where they come from, how they operate. And it's the most medieval of topics. You may not realize this, but that is in fact the case. And so what I'm doing here is I'm starting out with a more pan-European approach, because this was a Europe-wide phenomena. And And then I'm going to narrow it down to English institutions. The two main universities that obviously during the medieval period that you already know about are Oxford and Cambridge, and those are the two that I'll talk about because they were the main ones. They were the principal ones during the era. And to understand, of course, where these universities come from, you need to know a little bit about education in the Middle Ages prior to this. So I'm going to talk a little bit about late Rome and the early Middle Ages and earlier educational institutions, so you have the basis for understanding why the universities were so significant in such an innovation, and an innovation institutionally that has had continuous existence down to the present day. And so let's talk about learning during the early Middle Ages. And as a preface to this, we'll say a few words about the Roman Empire because obviously when you think about the Middle Ages are, and I think I gave you this formula at the beginning of the semester, it's basically sort of Latin culture plus church culture plus Germanic culture equals the Middle Ages. And this is just an element of this. So if you were living during the period of the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire existed from 27 BC down to 476 AD as a political entity in Western Europe, education in the Roman Empire had a public purpose, but they didn't create public educational institutions. This education that was publicly directed was given through private institutions, through private schools and private tutors. The Romans, however, they created a brand of education that was common to the ruling elite throughout the empire. If you were a mover or a shaker, a member of the elite within the Roman world during the early imperial period, every member of that elite would have had access to the basic elements of this education. There was a sort of a standardization to it in a way. If you want to understand the content of the education, there's no better place to go than the late Republican writer Varro. He died actually in 27 BC, which was the date that we date the beginning of the Roman Empire with Augustus. And so he's telling you what's there, how it's conceived in the late Republic. And his idea is the way Romans understood education continued to be influential during the empire. And this eventually, in certain respects, feeds into the early medieval period, high medieval period that we're going to be talking about here. He wrote a treatise on education, Varro did. And in it, he identified what he called the liberal arts, the type of education that a free person would be expected to have. And by free, it wasn't necessarily free in our sense. What they meant by that, largely speaking, was free from the need to work with one's hands. It's sort of like this honorable, dishonorable thing that we talked about a little bit in the town and country lecture. So this is a sort of an elite education that the free person would have access to. And these liberal arts, there were 9 of them, according to Varro. And I'll just run through the list. It's on the transparency. That grammar, rhetoric, and dialectic or logic, those two terms were used interchangeably, as well as geometry, arithmetic, astronomy, music, medicine, and architecture. And so it was considered that if you were a well-educated Roman, a member of the elite, you would have been exposed to all of these things. So it's a fairly broad education, actually. And this becomes the model for education in the Roman Empire. But what happens fairly rapidly is that most of the emphasis ends up on the first 3, grammar, rhetoric, and dialectic/logic. Those become the 3 most important of these disciplines. And if you got this education, it was a literary education in great works. You learned a lot of this stuff by reading great writers in these fields. And in terms of, the 3 that we're talking about, grammar, rhetoric, and logic, there was a focus particularly upon writers during classical Greece, during the 5th century. And if you've had any sort of education at all, you know who a lot of these people are. And then there was a focus also on the writers of the late Roman Republic, the Ciceros and Livies, and those sorts of people. So it's this focus upon these 2 particular periods that were considered sort of cultural high points in both the Greek tradition and in the Latin tradition. And an educated Roman would have both of these, both Greek and Latin. So you'd be working somewhat bilingually, since these are the 2 main languages within the empire. Latin is the universal language, but if you're in the East, Greek is very important as well. And so in terms of his education as a method, it was an education that was directed towards something called imitatio. And yeah, the English word is perfectly equivalent to that. It means imitation. What you were taught to do if you got the full run of the education was to be able to emulate the language and style of the originals. Read Livy, learn to write like Livy. Read Cicero, learn to write like Cicero, to imitate it as closely as you can. Obviously, those were very talented writers, and not everybody can come up to that standard, but that was certainly the goal, to have your Latin to the point that you could write in this fashion. And in terms of getting this education, parents of within elite families would begin to give their children a particular type of instruction. It begins for these children usually with a private tutor. And this tutor, well, he's called in the documents the Latin term Magister Ludi, which is also the title of a very famous Hermann Hesse novel, for whatever that's worth. And literally translated, it means master of the game. So that sounds nice. You tell little Billy that you're going to go visit the master of the game, and he's probably pretty happy. That sounds pretty good. And it's with this Magister Ludi that the child would get the basics of reading and writing, like what we would get in our early, elementary school educations. The Magister Ludi placed a great emphasis upon memory. They would have the kids memorize passages of works and have them memorize, obviously, grammar so that you could use it properly, so you could understand it. Now, if you're the parents, you're paying a private tuition, and as is ever the case, if you're forking out this money for the kid to learn something, you expect results. And what that meant is that the Magister Ludi could have the full range of tools in the pedagogical toolbox, which meant that if little Billy wasn't learning quickly enough, he could whale the living crap out of him. In other words, corporal punishment and beating was a big part of this education, and the parents didn't balk at that. And I should note that this obviously is very alien to your experience, but I'm an old guy. And when I was in elementary school, all the way up through junior high school and into high school in Kentucky, teachers were still allowed to whale students. I managed to avoid it because I was kind of a nerd for the most part, but I won't say that I was totally alien to the concept either. And I have to wonder sometimes, this is going to sound terrible, but have we somewhat damaged ourselves by not being able to use Richtersphere as a teaching tool? I will not answer that question, but I'll let you consider it. Yeah, it is something to think about. Anyway, this is how it would work. And when I think about this, I always think about a particular segment of Monty Python's Life of Brian, which for my money is one of their best films, actually. It's one that's seen less than some of the others, but if you get a chance, take a look at it sometime. In the film, there's a section where our hero Brian, who's gotten himself involved in a zealot movement and has been instructed by the zealots to put slogans up on the walls. And what he's trying to do in Jerusalem, he's trying to paint in good Latin the phrase "Romans go home." In other words, he wants the Romans to leave Judea. And as he's doing this, a centurion walks up next to him. And the centurion looks at the Latin, realizes that the grammar's not correct, and he gives our hero Brian a little lesson by the centurion method. He holds a knife to his throat and makes him properly decline nouns and conjugate verbs until he gets the phrase right, basically. And so this is this notion of using fear as a teaching tool, and Brian actually does pretty well. He gets it right. He writes it many times on the walls. Actually, he's instructed to. The centurion says he wants him to write it 100 times and get it right. And so he goes ahead and does that. Now, once the child has completed his years from, say, ages 6 to 10 with the Magister Ludi, if the parents want him to have further education, and it's him in most instances here, although women do sometimes get this education, he is then sent to a grammaticus. And it's here, this would be from ages 10 to 15. It's here that they would get emphasis upon good speech and good writing. And this is where the real process of imitatio begins, where you learn to imitate the great writers. And so that's what they're doing in what for most of us would be our late elementary, junior high, and early high school years. And for most people, this is where the education stopped. They would get the imitatio here, and this is what they would have for the rest of their lives. It doesn't mean that education couldn't continue, but this was the most common sort of model that people would have for this education. As the empire, however, declines and collapses as you move into the 4th and 5th centuries, the idea of this sort of teaching disappears because the private teachers tend to disappear. The system begins to fall apart, basically. But they do try to preserve some of this knowledge. And it's at this point you have the emergence of something called the handbook tradition, where they take the content of this liberal arts education and they condense it down to its basics. And you begin to see these single handbooks appear that purport to give you the fundamentals of the education within the covers of one book. You have some writers appear. The example I give you in the overhead is this guy named Marcianus Capella, who lived sometime during the 5th century. In his version of the liberal arts, he drops medicine and architecture because he thinks that they're professional disciplines. And this is how they come to be treated in the Middle Ages, actually. So it's boiled down to 7 liberal arts for him, down from Varro's 9. And to run through them again, it would be grammar, rhetoric, and dialectic or logic, and then geometry, arithmetic, astronomy, music. These were the 7 liberal arts, and this becomes standardized during the Middle Ages, basically. And so you go from Varro's 9 down to Marciana Capella's 7. And it's considered, if you can get exposure to these, that's great. As you'll discover, it gets narrowed down even a bit more over time. And so you have Marcianus Capella producing this little handbook with little essays on each of the 7 liberal arts. You have other writers doing very similar things like Boethius, Cassiodorus Senator. We don't need to talk about them, but it's all this notion of a handbook tradition. And so what you're seeing essentially as you move away from the empire into the early Middle Ages is not a knowledge explosion, but a knowledge implosion, which leads us to the disappearance of the Greco-Roman culture and the Roman system of education. It kind of goes away for a while. And if you want to use the term Dark Ages to describe the Middle Ages, and I caution you that medievalists hate that term. You don't want to use it in front of a medievalist. But this is the one context in which, to a certain degree, you can apply it because of this knowledge implosion. Basically, as you move away from the empire and you move into the 7th and the 8th centuries, and you're well into the early medieval period at that point, you have virtually no intellectual activity except for within a handful of monasteries. There are a couple of writers who appear as almost aberrations during this period when learning declines. In Spain, you have this man named Isidore of Seville, living from 560 until around 636. He was an amazing scholar, but he was a person operating sort of in an intellectual desert. And the other example is somebody you've already encountered in a different context. This guy called the Venerable Bede, who was writing in England, sitting in a little monastery, freezing his tuchus off and doing amazing things there. So to the point that he's constantly referred back to by later writers in the English tradition and actually in the European tradition. He was not just of English importance, he was of pan-European importance as a writer and an intellectual. You indirectly get exposed to his ecclesiastical history, which everybody refers back to during this period, but he wrote in an amazing range of fields. And so if you want to know about early medieval intellectual life, you have to know about Isidore and you have to know about Bede. And basically in the north, once you move north of the Alps, away from Italy, the public schools had long been gone by this time. And by public schools, I mean private tutors, basically. They didn't really have public schools. And you also begin to see a great linguistic shift. In the areas that had been most firmly under Roman control, say Italy, Spain, and France, their spoken language begins to deviate considerably from written Latin. And what this means is that you begin to see the development of Romance languages. You begin to see the creation of Proto-French, Proto-Spanish, Proto-Italian. And by the 8th century, even the clergy in Romance-speaking regions, they have to study Latin carefully because their spoken language by that point is so far distant from written Latin. And so this is where you see Latin becoming a dead language, a language that's not spoken, but a language that's written universally whereas on the ground, you're having these other languages appear. If you move into Germanic-speaking regions, this was a problem from the outset. In what would become Germany or in England, places like that, it's even more pronounced. So that by around 700, even great laymen were usually illiterate. They're just mounted feudal thugs by that point, and monks became the great writing officers. And so where you have literacy, it's usually where you would have monastic institutions. Uh, and between 600 and 1000, the quadrivium, those four more scientific disciplines, geometry, arithmetic, music, astronomy, they largely disappear. To the degree that the liberal arts are taught, the focus is upon the first three: grammar, rhetoric, and dialectic or logic. And dialectic is de-emphasized in favor of just grammar and rhetoric. And so you see this narrowing down of education. But as you go on, and you've moved into, late 6th century, early 7th century, moving into the 8th century, in the 8th century, you do see a brief appearance of light again. You have this thing called the Carolingian Renaissance. It's this effort to revive sort of the Roman Empire in a different form, and it's associated with this great king, Charlemagne, that you would hear about ad nauseum if you've taken an early medieval course. Basically, he establishes his court as sort of an intellectual center. And you see an effort to try to revive a type of education for a period under Charlemagne and his immediate successors. Between around 740, and this even precedes Charlemagne a bit, in 870, you do have a literary revival based upon the Greco-Roman past. And you see a concentration of learned men at the court of Charlemagne, this great Germanic king who had pretensions of being a Roman emperor, a revived Roman emperor. Of them, there's one person who's more important than any of them. There's this fellow named Alcuin of York, an Englishman. Charlemagne persuaded him to come to his court, and he became sort of the intellectual mayor domo, the intellectual maitre d' there. What Alcuin tried to do is he tried to revive the Roman educational system based upon the 7 liberal arts. That was his goal. In reality, his emphasis was mostly on grammar, just getting people good language, as good Latin as far as he could. And perhaps most importantly, what Alcuin and the other people did within the Carolingian Empire is they created scriptoria. They created writing offices. And this is of crucial cultural importance. It's probably the greatest intellectual contribution this Carolingian Renaissance made. Basically, what these scriptoria would do is they would copy books, which led to the creation of libraries and the preservation of quite a bit of knowledge. And it's a fascinating thing, as you probably discovered from looking at the backgrounds here. I'm actually in the other end of the bunker where I gave you your first video where I was talking about course policy. And to get rid of the glare from the fluorescent lighting, I'm sitting down. So I look a little less weird. But you probably notice your background for all 3 of these lectures, well, it's been books. I keep a lot of my books in the basement. And I don't really know at this point how many I have. And I've never really thought about it in terms of quantity anyway. When I left UR to do other things in 2016, I had to break down my office there, which meant all my medieval stuff came home to be added to all my personal reading, which meant that I had to basically reorganize things. And I ended up sending some things that either I'd read and probably wouldn't be reading again or didn't need immediately into storage. And I do know how many books I placed into storage because I kept a database of it, a spreadsheet of it, so that I can know where something was at in the individual boxes in case I ever needed it again. And I can tell you that in storage, I have 1,318 books. And down here, I don't know what I have. It's a lot, probably by most people's standards. I'm an old guy. I've accumulated a lot over the years. And you can see behind me a lot of my dictionaries and stuff. I have dictionaries in several languages, a lot of Latin dictionaries because of what I've done over the years. And I keep all my pleasure reading down here and some remaining professional stuff and research stuff that I use. And I have a lot of books upstairs. And my wife has a lot of books, and she has a lot up on the 2nd floor. She has a lot on the 1st floor. We split bookcases there. And then she has her office, which many of you have been in. She has a ton of them. So we live in this world where we can have these massive personal libraries because of the printing press, the ability to produce books quite inexpensively. And And so I literally own thousands of books. And I didn't even mention the damn comic books. I have about 1,000 Italian language graphic novels because that's how I learned to read Italian, actually. I did it using comic books. And it's, and you know, just loads of stuff. So we have these vast personal libraries. And as you probably gathered, for me, reading is the top great pleasure of my life. You know, I was so excited when I was sent to first grade and told I would be taught to read. And it's been a continuing thing since then. Other things I like to do, obviously, but this has been sort of my world and it's been my access to the world. And the reason why I go on this long digression about my personal library is that, yeah, I can collect all the stuff. And then through the internet, I have access to everything. And through our big libraries, I have access to the world as well. These big libraries during the early Middle Ages, this sort of gives you a sense of scale. The biggest of them was at Fulda, one of these Carolingian monasteries, and it had about 1,000 volumes in it. And even within that, there's a lot of repetition because they would have multiple copies of the same book. The next largest was Lorsch, which had about 600 volumes during the Carolingian period. And so it gives you the sense of the scale of the knowledge implosion and what the entirety of the society had access to. Owning a book personally was a great thing. It was a rarity during this period. And these libraries, even the big ones, were exceedingly limited. And I should also note parenthetically, if you're interested in this notion of medieval libraries and the transmission of medieval knowledge, I do recommend actually a novel that I alluded to in a different context, Umberto Eco's Name of the Rose. And also, there's the movie treatment of it with Sean Connery, the former James Bond, and a very young Christian Bale, which gives you some elements of it because the entire thing circulates around medieval written knowledge and a great scriptorium in the library and the way medieval people thought about learning and knowledge. And so take a look at it sometimes if you get a chance. I don't think you'll be disappointed. Particularly read the novel. It's a great novel, actually. If you like medieval mysteries, and that's what it is. It's set up basically as a mystery. Murders in the Abbey, and the murders are somewhat apocalyptic. Uh, that being said, you get the sense of scale. Uh, so until Alcuin's death, this movement continued and broadened, and even after his death, they continued to copy and place things in libraries. And this is of crucial importance because virtually every classical Latin author that we have today, it survives in one of these copies made during the Carolingian era. In other words, no Carolingian Renaissance, no Italian Renaissance. When the Italian Renaissance scholars began to try to recreate these works, and Petrarch is a great example of this early proto-Renaissance person, what they would do is they would scour the monasteries of Italy and Northern Europe to find copies of manuscripts of Latin writers. And if they could find multiple copies, that was great because then they could collate them and begin to do types of textual criticism in order to get at definitive versions of them. And so this copying going on, these little monks freezing their buns off, working very hard to copy, it's what allowed us to have knowledge of a lot of what we have. And somebody's looking at me.
I want a dog.
Yes, I've been told by my wife that she wants a dog. Okay. Well, having said that, so you have this copying, which allows us to know a lot about the classical world. This is where it happened, essentially. To say a few words about Charlemagne himself, he was a great partisan of these ideas. He supported this intellectual movement. And in the latter part of his reign, sometime between 780 and 800, he issued a very particular capitulary or law. And in this law, it reflects his desire to reform and improve the clergy in his empire. And he sees education as central to that he ordered all people within either the secular or regular clergy, priests or monks, to try to give education to anybody with the capacity to learn. He wants to broaden education and have a very educated clergy if he can manage it. And this particular law was echoed in legislation by Charlemagne's successors for a time. In effect, it's in order to create monastic and cathedral schools, to give people, maybe a few more people, access to education. It was a very creative idea. However, it was never comprehensively implemented. And I'm getting an evil eye again from my wife, so I guess the instruction continues. that we need to get a dog. Well, we'll see about that. Bearing in mind that I am, in fact, allergic to dogs. Despite this law becoming a dead letter fairly soon, his idea, like many things from the Carolingian Empire, survived as a memory, as a precedent, as a basis for future action. But the problem was that, of course, the Carolingian Empire disintegrated. And the reason for that partially was this violence of the 9th and 10th centuries, where you see a lot of feudal violence and you see the invasions by the Vikings, Magyars, and Muslims, and encroachments on part of Europe. And so you enter another very dark century where things take a step back, which leads us to medieval education in the High Middle Ages and the universities, what we will be talking about in great detail. Well, what you probably have already realized, that education, to the degree it existed during the medieval period, was dominated by the church, because that's where you had literacy. Literacy is the essential element for education, obviously. But you do begin to see around the year 1000, around the time of the first millennium, a revival of educational institutions. And there's some overlap between these institutions, but there is a kind of linearity to it as well. You start out with these things called monastic schools, and you eventually end up with something called the university. And so we're going to work our way up to it, basically. Monastic schools, where did these come from? Well, it's kind of an obvious thing, actually, when you think about it. You have Benedict's rule, and we talked about that a little bit when we were talking about monasteries. The Benedictine rule requires reading. One of the 3 basic requirements is that the monks do spiritual reading. And we mentioned that how the monks, every year at Lent, they would be assigned a book to read during that for their spiritual improvement. They're also expected to be able to read the rule and the Bible and the great church fathers. And so reading was fundamental, actually, in the monasteries. But the interesting thing about the rule is that it makes no provision for teaching. And the reason for this is that Benedict, he was living, he was born in the late 5th century, lives into the 6th century. And during his time, there was still the survival of some of this private schooling, tutors and small private academies. And so Benedict didn't think along those lines. His assumption was that if a monk was entering, the monk would already have gotten the basics of literacy. Obviously, as time moves on, the assumption was flawed because these institutions fall apart. And what that means is that they tend to need to provide some sort of educational institution. There's also another phenomenon that arises that contributes to this. You begin to have the phenomenon of what's called child oblates. These were children given as a gift to the monastery. It's not an uncommon thing. It becomes increasingly common, actually, during the Middle Ages as things become more ugly and unstable, that people would surrender their children to a monastery. And you need to educate these children. And so, for a couple of reasons, there begins to be a real need to actually have some sort of educational institution created within the monasteries. And monastic culture is also very complex, actually, as you've probably discovered from the rule. It operates according to a specific rhythm and a specific set of expectations of people. So you need to learn the culture in order to fit into it, to meet that basic requirement of changing your habits. So what begins to happen, well, first of all, before we get to it, what happens institutionally, we should also note that monastic life had a rich intellectual culture based upon the Bible and the church fathers, and the monks needed to be indoctrinated into this culture. All these things demand literacy, and it's inconceivable monastic life without books and without literacy. You had to have books within a monastery as teaching tools to allow people to be inculcated with this culture. And even in the worst circumstances, as unstable as things became during the early Middle Ages, there's usually preservation of some learning in monasteries. With the fall of the empire, schools within the monasteries become absolutely essential. And if you look at monastic schools, they're usually divided into 2 types. There's a school for the education of children, an education of the monks within the house, an internal school of some sort. And then sometimes you would see something called an extern school, meaning external. This is for monks from other houses who might appear for a time to have traveled in and to get a specific type of learning and return to to their own houses. And for other students, although it's rare, they do sometimes admit secular people into these monastic schools, the children of important nobles, those sorts of people. Only wealthier houses could support dual schools, where you'd have both an internal and an external school. Many smaller monasteries couldn't even afford a formal school, and the education would be done in a tutorial way where a monk would be assigned as a tutor for an individual child or an individual monk to give them their basic literacy. And so for some of these monks, as they enter, it wasn't just, making a profession. They also have to be educated once they come in. They have to get their basic literacy during, maybe their novitiate, and it would continue once they become monks. In terms of what would be taught in a monastic school, it's a very narrow curriculum. We've already mentioned the primary purpose of the school is to prepare monks for monastic life. Consequently, they read the scriptures. They need to be able to read the Bible. They read it assiduously. They read it every day, some portion of it. And they need to read the church fathers. They need to read Augustine. They need to read Jerome. They need to read these other early great writers within the Christian tradition. There's very little original work done in these monasteries. It's not there. They're not created. They're not designed to engage in great intellectual debates initially. They're there to give people the literacy they need to function in the monastic context. And they're reluctant to educate laymen because it's a violation of the monastic mission. It doesn't mean it doesn't happen. Sometimes they're given no choice. If the person who is the patron of the monastery says, "Educate my son," then you educate his son, and that happens, but it's not what they would prefer to do. For the 2 centuries after Charlemagne, the monasteries dominated education, so say from around 800 to about 1000. This is the principal educational institution in Western Europe, bar none. And in terms of the more famous ones, you have a great monastic school at Tours, one at Fulda, obviously, because of the library there, at Reichenau. And beyond this, there are a couple of really exceptional monastic schools. They became famous for it. One, an obvious one, would be at Monte Cassino. This was Benedict's home monastery, the one he created. And it had a big, fair-sized library. Beyond that, because of its Mediterranean connections, there were some Greek works in it. So they weren't just doing it in Latin. You could get some exposure to Greek there. And also to Greek works placed into Latin translation, which is a crucially important intellectual development. And here I'll give you one example. At Monte Cassino, you had a guy working, a guy named Constantine the African, from Africa, obviously, North Africa, and he translated into Latin the works of Hippocrates and Galen, the 2 great medical writers of Greek classical antiquity. And what this means is as these works begin to disseminate in Italy in both Latin and Greek form, you begin to have a tradition of medical education in Italy. This particularly becomes true at the city of Salerno, the modern city of Salerno. One of the great medical schools in the medieval period was actually based in Salerno in southern Italy, and Salerno is not that far from Monte Cassino, so there's a geographical connection there, obviously. And so you have Monte Cassino is a great center of monastic learning. In the north, you have Bec. And this should ring a bell because you've heard about it before, because both Lanfranc and Anselm, these 2 great archbishops of Canterbury, they had been monks at Bec and had served in the hierarchy at Bec. And so when they come over, obviously, they bring this influence with them as well when they come to England to become Archbishop of Canterbury successively. So you have the monastic schools. So from 800 to around 1000, they're the great institutions of learning, the preservers in medieval Europe. And then you begin to also see the appearance of cathedral schools. And you don't have one of these in every diocese, but they're relatively common. They're usually administered by either a chancellor or a scholasticus, a schoolmaster. Cathedral schools are in existence as early as around the year 1000. So they start a little later than the monastic schools, but they overlap in time with them. The first objective of the cathedral school is to educate the secular clergy. This is where your parish priest would get his education, where he would get basic literacy and exposure to the scriptures, exposure to the church fathers, hopefully, for use in their ministering to their flocks once they're out in their parishes. These students were students in these schools were they were usually boys slash clerks who were bound for the priesthood. Uh, the priesthood was a place where actually supernumerary sons could be planted. In other words, if you're one of these mounted feudal thugs, your eldest son is going to inherit your fief and become a knight, but you have these younger sons, and the church was always a place you could put them. You could place them in a monastery, good possibility. You could also direct them toward the clergy, and this would happen with great frequency. These boys, they would live with the cathedral canons in most instances, the priest that are permanently assigned quasi-monastically to the cathedral. And you begin to have notable cathedral schools as educational and learning centers appear after a certain point. You have a very well-known one at Reims by around 990. By around 1100, cathedral schools were competitive with monastic schools in terms of what they were offering. And you have a heavy concentration of cathedral schools in central and northern France. Now, I'll just give you a quick list here. You don't need to memorize the stuff, but just to give you a sense of it. You have Reims, of course, Lyon, Chartres, Notre Dame in Paris. Yes, it unfortunately burned within the last year. Nivelles, Tournai, Soissons, Orléans were all important, and there were others beyond these, as these educational centers based upon a bishop's diocesan church. And they became the most important educational institution during the 12th century. They began to supersede the monastic schools because their mission was slightly different. They tended to be in urban centers, obviously. Bishops, they are usually in cities. You do have a bishop in Richmond. His cathedral's right down by VCU. You can go visit it when you come back to town if you want to see it. And because they're in urban centers and they're dealing with the secular as opposed to the regular clergy, they're more attuned to worldly needs. They're more open to intellectual innovation than monastic schools. In terms of the curriculum, they try to adopt the Roman model. The seven liberal arts, again, the trivium, the grammar, rhetoric, and dialectic we talked about, and then the quadrivium, mathematics, astronomy, music, geometry. The trivium was in better shape, actually, as you move from 1000 into the late 11th and 12th century. So that's where most of the focus was. But they try to do a little bit of the others as well. These studies, and use the Latin term, the artes liberales, the liberal arts, they were disciplines that improve the mind. And if you think about our modern education, a lot of this we're trying to inculcate into you as you have your university education, essentially. Few of these schools were able to teach a fully comprehensive program. It's few of them that could do all seven, but they would do as many of them as they could. And some schools came to be noted for teaching particular topics, and sometimes beyond these seven liberal arts. For instance, at Lyon, there was a lot of theology taught, which was considered the highest discipline during the medieval period, and we'll talk about this a bit more later. At Orléans, there was a great grounding in the Latin classics. If you wanted to read, some of these basically late Republican, early Empire Latin authors, that's where you would go. At Chartres, they tended more toward the more scientific subjects. They did teach a fair amount of the quadrivium there. And so there's a bit of specialization from place to place, as is the case with any university. Every university has its thing that it places a greater emphasis on. And so, basically UR, for instance, is very unusual in that it has an undergraduate business school. A lot of universities don't have this. And the Jepson School, obviously, is its own little thing over to the side, doing something very different than what you see in most universities. And even within the arts and sciences faculty, which is most of the university at Richmond, since it's a liberal arts college, you have some disciplines emphasized more than other, larger and smaller faculties. Some departments are better known in their own field than others. That's just the nature of things at every university. Men began to go to cathedral schools in larger numbers during the 11th and 12th centuries. And so they grow in size. And at this point, I'm talking about actually cathedral schools not just taking in younger boys bound for the priesthood, but more adult men going there to get access to the education that they offered. These men would present themselves as clerks, men who had declared a profession for the church, and they would take the first tonsure and enter into what's called minor orders. one of the most famous intellectuals of the High Medieval period, this man named Peter Abelard. He's very famous because, not just because he was one of the great thinkers and writers of his day, great theologian. He also got involved with this woman named Heloise, and it was one of the great romance stories of the Middle Ages. It was actually made into, there was a modern novel by a woman named Marion Mead called Stealing Heaven, which is not a bad historical novel. It was made into a movie by the same title a number of years ago, where you get to see the playing out of the Heloise Abelard story. But anyway, he was a clericus. He was in minor orders. Uh, this permitted people like Abelard to attend, and eventually he's teaching and lecturing at these places because he was working in the pre-university era. If there had been universities, he would have been at the university probably, but he's working in the cathedral schools. But these men in minor orders, they could also leave when they wanted. It was not a permanent commitment. Some of them would eventually stay in clerical orders, eventually become priests and enter the clergy or become monks and enter a monastery. But they could come and they could, I won't say they could come and go, but they could certainly come and then go out into the secular world if that's what they wanted to do. We should note that neither the monastic school nor the cathedral school was a degree granting institution. You would not get the sheepskin for going to these places. You would get the education. And so that tells you a lot of why people would go there. Now, there are a couple of other one more institutional consideration, and then one other consideration, and then we'll begin to make the transition toward universities. In the 11th century, you begin to see something appear called municipal schools. Basically, these appeared in major cities in northern Italy, the place that's being ravaged by the coronavirus, worse than most other places right now. Basically, these appeared to meet the needs of urban centers, and they would teach grammar. We should note that in Italy, in terms of the implosion of knowledge during the early Middle Ages, things never got quite as bad in Italy as they did elsewhere. You can probably assume that grammar to some degree was still being taught in Italy in various places during the early Middle Ages, and perhaps some teaching of law in parts of Italy. It's hard to get at, but it was probably going on to some extent. The municipal schools, these city schools, they, for some of these northern Italian towns, serve some of the same function as the cathedral schools do in northern Europe, to give, a basic education to people. And then beyond the municipal schools, the cathedral schools, monastic schools, you would have private peripatetic masters, wandering masters. This would be a person who would move from place to place, from school to school, and offer to teach for a fee. They would attract and sometimes take with them a following on the basis of their personal qualities and charisma. It would be this guy who would come into town and seem far more interesting as a teacher and a lecturer than the people who were working within an institution. And they were particularly attractive to younger people who liked that sort of thing. They were sort of the educational rock stars, and little sort of cults of personality in many cases would build up around them. There's one in particular, this guy named Anselmo Basate, also known as Anselm the Peripatetic, because he's walking around all over the place. He was working in the 11th century and developed a bit of a following, sort of a traveling teacher. These guys sometimes call themselves sophists, which is an interesting term. Maybe I'll come back to it at some point and talk about that a bit more. But they were very flashy and appealed to a certain constituency, particularly the youth, because the youth liked flashy. For more traditional masters, they were kind of the boogeyman, because they would draw away their students from their schools, so they weren't much liked by people working in more traditional institutions. Now, so this is sort of the state of education as you've moved past the millennium and into the 11th and 12th centuries. But, when you think about society, and you already know this, we've talked about it from various contexts already, society, as you move into the high medieval period firmly, it begins to have new needs. The society is becoming more complex as Europe moves into the high Middle Ages. You have the expansion of government and church bureaucracies, which we've talked about in excruciating detail at various points this semester. And there's a far greater reliance on the law and on written records. And we've sliced and diced that in various ways so far. You have the emergence of a new elite, people who are judges and lawyers and notaries and bureaucrats to make these institutions run. And they needed not just literacy, but they also needed knowledge. They needed a broader education. And there's a greater need for educated clerks, people with just basic writing knowledge to produce the documents. Not thoroughly necessarily, but as somebody who would take somebody else's work and put it in nice written form. It's more of a secretarial function, actually. You also have this expansion of commerce. And as commerce expands, it becomes more and more of a literate sort of thing to do. That literacy is really helpful for negotiating and writing contracts, and they begin to produce these during the medieval period. You know, in the past, actually, a course I've offered at UR has been a course on the medieval economy, where we talk about this. And I'd spend a couple of days in that talking about the appearance of basically accounting, you know, double entry bookkeeping, and also various types of contracts, business arrangements during the medieval period. And you need literacy for this. You can't be an illiterate dupe. You know, there's certain types of trade you can do, and you wouldn't need to be that literate. But for really high-end trade and commerce, literacy is a necessity. And what this means is that as these bureaucracies expand and as commerce expands, there are more and more opportunities for certain types of career for people within the bourgeoisie, this developing sort of middle class that we talked about in the last topic. And what is clear is that monastic and cathedral schools, by their function, they're not suited for this and they're not capable of this. It's just too much. The demand is too great, and they don't want the world intruding on them this much, actually. And so you need a new type of educational institution. And this institution eventually appears. It's this thing called the university. And so this is the end of the first half of the discussion. I'm going to cut it off right here. I'm going to go have myself a tea and get this thing to start uploading. And I'm also going to give myself time for a brief costume change. So this is where the cosplay element of the lecture emerges. And I'll post this as part 1. Part 2 will be forthcoming. So stay tuned, and we'll talk to you in a bit. Bye-bye.